dope, kiff, draw, stuff, dank, tea, green, chiba, endo, nug, herb, mota, chronic, bud, ganja, the devil's lettuce, sinsemilla, sticky, icky, wacky, tobacco, hashish, Mary Jane, reefer, grass, pot, weed, indica, sativa, edibles, vape, flower, cannabis, and marijuana. Whatever you name it, however you absorb it, whoever sells it to you, I mean, unless you grow your own, of course, whether it be legal or not, it is undeniably one of the largest selling commodities in the world, has been since the 50s. We sit on the precipice of a new frontier in American business. What was once a literal cash crop is now becoming a sustainable and respectable entrepreneurial enterprise with a farm to market paradigm consistent with any ordinary produce you'd find at your local grocery store. And with that comes the usual sidebar businesses employed to generate the steady flow of commerce. The Buzzards previously examined those few insurance companies willing to work with growers, distributors, and sellers. On this episode, we'll be discussing Sean Stiefel's cannabis-focused hedge fund, Navy Capital, something that would have been ludicrous to think about nearly 5 years ago. What's more, we are also being joined once again by cannabis industry expert Brian Jones, and he's back by popular demand. So put that in your pipe and smoke it and inhale another episode of $5 Buzz.
Step inside, lock the door behind you, and please make sure the towel is properly positioned. You're stepping in once again on $5 Buzz. My name is George Kursar, and I come to you from Fairfield, Connecticut today. Pete Liska, how are you, sir? How is Santa Barbara treating you?
Santa Barbara is great. We are up here on what the kids call a baby moon. Wife is having a baby in 5 weeks, so we came up for a couple of days, got a nice hotel, and she's at the beach currently, and I'll be joining her after we finish up here.
Excellent. Well, I hope you really enjoy this last few weeks of not being a dad. Your life is going to change tremendously, but it's never going to be the same. So enjoy every second of it. Roger, how are you today, sir?
I'm great. You know, I'm in Van Nuys cat sitting for a couple of friends of ours that just got married recently. Right. As they're on their honeymoon, and they're in Italy as of today.
Wow.
So, yeah, just hanging out and watching a shit ton of movies.
Great. Good to hear. And we're welcome back on this episode, as we're calling this the Cannabis episode part 2. It was a very popular episode with our listeners, so we wanted to bring Brian Jones back again. Brian Jones comes to us. Are you currently in North Carolina? Is that correct?
Well, today I'm in Atlanta. I'm at the new office at the new company that we talked about last time. So
right. And can you just, if you don't mind, would you mind just giving everybody a brief refresher on what your kind of role is at this point in time as it relates to the cannabis industry?
Sure. So as everybody can recall, I started underwriting directors and officers insurance for the cannabis industry in 2017. Been involved in the industry since then, and then recently went over to a new company called QuadScore, and we are providing more capacity to a capacity-starved market. So been doing a lot of work reviewing companies and laws, and it's been quite exciting.
Right. And it's interesting that today, as we record this, the great state of New Jersey is making a lot of announcements as it relates to cannabis on the recreational side, I believe. But a man that we've also invited to join, and we're very lucky to have, is Sean Stiefel, who, Sean, are you in Westport, Connecticut?
I'm in Westport, Connecticut.
Wow, man, I just moved not too far down the street. We'll have to meet up at Geronimo's or Zudo's at some point for a drink.
Sounds good to me. Hudson Malone is my spot.
Great, man. So Sean, you and I have known each other a little bit. We both met, I want to say it was like around like, I want to say like 2014 or 2015. You might remember better than me. I was working at Jefferies, which for folks that may not be familiar is an investment bank. And they were having a really good run in the IPO space at that point in time. And I think, Sean, before you got into the cannabis space, you had more of a traditional finance, New York, Wall Street, for lack of a better term, career. Would you mind just giving the folks, the listeners, just a little origin story about yourself, how you grew up? And I know that you went to USC undergrad, so maybe if you just take a couple minutes to tell your story.
Yeah, sure. Jersey guy, born in Princeton, New Jersey, ended up going to USC, as you said, for college, and always thought that I wanted to get back into the world of stock picking, and went down a pretty traditional path out of school, worked at a big investment bank, worked at a big hedge fund, worked at another hedge fund, and then ultimately came to the conclusion I wanted to run my own money and run my own ideas. And so I started an AD Capital in 2014, really focused on traditional investing. Nothing more sexy than that. Got a call in 2016 from one of the Canadian brokers that we were doing business with, who literally said, if you like making money, take this meeting. I like making money, so I took the meeting. It ended up being the first company out of Uruguay being the first country in the world to go fully adult use legal, was doing a pre-IPO raise. We took the meeting kind of for entertainment purposes more so than anything. And by the end of it said, if 1% of what these guys say is true, it's a home run. Ended up investing pre-money at kind of a $40 million valuation. Company went public 4 months later at about $160 million valuation. Subsequently was acquired for about $300 million, and kind of said to myself, what is this cannabis thing? So really tried to get up to speed as fast as I can through 2016, going all over the world, Israel, Australia, Europe, of course, Canada, to kind of see what the landscape was. Because at the time in 2016, California hadn't gone legal yet. You hadn't really seen any of the mass movements. And so you're still talking about like a quasi-medical market in the United States with legality issues and different things. And so by the end of 16, kind of came to the conclusion I could be to George's point, the 100,000th hedge fund, or I could be the first cannabis fund. And so we went all in. And May of 17, we launched our cannabis fund with less than 10 million bucks, just cognizant and getting up and running. Today, we run about 400 million, and we're the largest cannabis hedge fund out there. We invest predominantly today in US kind of quote unquote plant touching operators, MSOs, single state operators, brands. I'm on the board of several of them. And we have the luxury of being able to invest both in public markets and private markets. And so I've sort of seen it all over the years. And I think where the industry in general is really in the early stages of where we're going. And, you know, you can quantify that. You've got 24 billion of legal sales. You probably still have about 70 billion of illegal sales. And that's before we talk about your mom, your sister, your friend who's never used cannabis being able to kind of come into the arena via something that feels more normal, more like alcohol, less risky to them. So we think the market from here is an easy 4X, and pretty excited about what we're seeing.
That's great. And I know Pete and I were talking about some of what's going on in New Jersey, and I'll let him ask you guys some questions about that. But Sean, just really quickly, what was it like in the early days of you pitching your ideas and your firm and your fund? Were you faced with a lot of skepticism? I mean, I know in, you know, the 2014, 15, 16, obviously everyone was a lot more receptive to marijuana, but with the fact that it's not federally legal, it wasn't legal in as many states as it is now. Could you just tell us what it was like as you were going in on those meetings? Was there a degree of anxiety or hesitation? Or
Yeah,
was
I
it-
mean, look, I think in a lot of ways, not much has changed. You're still not seeing large institutional investors come into the space. You're seeing more for sure today than before. But I mean, when we started the fund, I think a lot of people didn't take it seriously. A lot of people didn't understand what was happening. The analogy I like to use is it's very similar to online gaming and what you've seen, or online gambling, and what you've seen with the normalization of sort of the sports books of the world and iLottery and iGaming. People think it's taboo, but then they look under the hood and they realize there's real benefits not only to kind of the economics here, but also to people, getting them off of opioids, getting them off of alcohol dependency. And so I think over time, it's no longer people are laughing, but for sure, you still, because of the federal illegality, 95% plus of the investor universe cannot own these stocks. Most people can't wake up and buy them in their own brokerage account, can't buy these stocks on Robinhood. And so that in and of itself is a huge opportunity when the gates open. But I would say to you, I think the stigma is gone, but the operational and the legal barriers are still very much there. And the institutional capital has yet to really come into the space in any meaningful way.
So we're in the very early innings. Obviously, it sounds like, but it seems like the institutional money is warming up to this, and maybe someday, 401ks and mutual funds will have positions and exposure to marijuana, which is exciting because, like our previous episode, we were talking to Will Hershey about video games and online gambling and sports gambling. There's a lot of money coming into the economy, and it's great that there's opportunity for some of these new businesses to get up and running, and things that weren't possible 5, 10, 15 years ago are possible. Brian, do you remain confident about, I know you started at a new firm. Are you seeing a lot of change? And I know we mentioned New Jersey, but is that a pretty big tipping point? New Jersey is, I think, the 8th largest state in terms of population. And we know everyone in New York is going to be crossing the border to make purchases of recreational weed the same way that they're driving across to bet on the USC Iowa game. I know you guys probably had some money probably on that 2019 match, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting thing with New Jersey coming online. New York's obviously going to be chasing on their tails. Connecticut as well. Do I think people are going to cross the border? I don't think they'll have to soon. You talk about the new states coming on. A lot of the Curaleafs of the world, the GTIs, they're all buying up stakes in these states. And I had watched an interview with Sean and him talking about how the big players are kind of the bell cows at this point. So they're gonna gobble up licenses. They're gonna gobble up operations, and we're gonna have a lot of consolidation. What I'm seeing right now is the first 8 months of this year has been a cash frenzy. There's been a lot of raises. There's been a lot of consolidation, and I think we're just getting started. You have the True Leaf Harvest deal. That's a massive deal. I don't think people understand, outside the cannabis world, how big that deal is. With True Leaf being a monster in Florida, now they're going to touch, over 10 states. Pennsylvania. I think a bigger thing in the Northeast is Pennsylvania's market is going to be fun to watch. They're full medical now, obviously, but just when they go recreational, just the population in that state. If you've ever driven across Pennsylvania, it's a long drive. So, what I find interesting now is going to be the consolidation. It's going to be the bigger players. I did a call last week with a player who, they want to get into this, and it's an established money player. A lot of Canadian companies that are getting options on companies in the States. The deal that was just announced by Tilray to buy up MedMen's debt. That's an interesting play. And then MedMen turning around and say we're gonna raise 100 million. So there's a lot of movement in terms of consolidation and money raising that is just getting started.
Right.
One of the things that has to happen, though, right? I mean, my question is, it's still on the controlled substance list. It's still, at the highest order of controlled substances like heroin. And I think that has to change before we're able to make it a federal possibility. What do you think about that?
So yeah, I think the act that was introduced in the Senate, it's interesting. If you read through it, the big negatives about that are the taxation, right? You're not really getting rid of a black market if you're going to tax this at the rates that they're talking. Um, Full federal legalization, I know we talked about it a little bit last time.
Yeah.
That's going to be a sticky situation. There's a lot of states out there that probably want to create their own rules, just like Colorado and California and these other states that have come online now are doing. You know, Oklahoma, Arkansas, those are some southern states. They're moving pretty quick. Texas is going to probably follow along, at least getting to the medical point like Florida is. And again, these are just my opinions, but I think that there's a lot of people that are going to call for this. Federal legalizations probably won't happen out of this bill, but there's going to be some changes, I would guess, in terms of insurance laws, banking, IRS, leeway to help people, with handling the money. You know, you don't want to see armored cars of cash running around to old bank vaults anymore. So I think, there's a lot of good analysis of that article, of that bill, that will show you this is going to come in baby steps. Full federal legalization, I think, is a ways away. I'd love to hear Sean's opinions on that, since he's been as involved as I have, in the last 5 years, if not more. So.
Yeah, I mean, I echo what you're saying. I think they shot the moon on this bill, asking for everything, knowing that they're not going to negotiate against themselves. And so in that sense, like you're going to probably get some form of a banking allowance, meaning that these companies can bank legally, they can take credit cards, ideally they can list on major exchanges. But you're also going to need to give something in terms of social equity, criminal justice reform, and getting people out of jail. So I mean, that's not an easy thing to do, either logistically or just even what does that even mean? So I think there's a lot to hash out. And I think part of the reason the stocks have been so weak over the last kind of month and a half since the bill came out was people looked at it and said, wow, they're so far from finding something that they can agree to, which, I do think there's pressure now, because at the end of the day, if you're going to try to help the communities that have been most disenfranchised, if they can't open a bank account and they can't get a loan and they can't start a business, there's nothing to even talk about here. So I do think that's like the core starting point, is you got to make it so that businesses have a viable shot. This is a tough industry, period, to build a profitable business. And so if you're talking about a scenario where you're giving out licenses for free to certain communities, they're walking into a very, very tough environment. And so you need to support them, not make it such that they can't get a bank account, they can't get payroll. In my case, for instance, I can't get life insurance and I don't even work directly in the industry. And so there's all sorts of things that people have to deal with on a day-to-day basis.
What happens to your fund if it goes federally legal? Is that a good thing? Or is it still up in the air?
Yeah, I mean, look, I always joke and say that there's different parts of that question. So I think the first reaction is the best day in the fund's history will be the day that these stocks start trading on the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ. I think that will be a huge uptick for us. Then you have to start thinking to yourself, what does full federal legalization mean? Does it mean we're going to have cross-border, meaning product from California can be sold in New York or New Jersey or Maine? If that happens, there's definitively parts of our portfolio that do incredibly well, and there's the parts of our portfolio that will take a hit. And so we're always kind of playing out these scenarios. And one of the reasons we like to be public and private is to reposition around those things. I mean, there's huge overhang risks. We could wake up one day and vape disappears. We could wake up one day and beverage is outlawed because the kid died. Not that that's ever happened or would happen, but these are the types of risks that you're dealing when you have a controlled substance. And so that's kind of how we're thinking about it. I think these stocks will re-rate. They're the cheapest stocks by growth on earth, and it doesn't make sense where they are. But then you have to start thinking about, if you're playing chess and all this product is now coming from California and Oregon, what happens to these $100 million grows in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania?
Yeah. But at the same time, I was thinking about things like cigarettes and booze. Both are federally legal. Yet each state has completely different set of rules for how they deal with it. There are even some dry counties, that won't allow drinking at all. There is, New York and and California have higher taxes on cigarettes and booze. What's it called? What's that tax called? Vice tax?
Excise tax.
Yes. And, so, I don't see that playing out any different. I mean, and you can buy booze and cigarettes online.
The difference is that all those cigarettes are generally made in the same place. So they may be retailed differently. So like if you break it down, cigarettes and cannabis, you grow it. So, you got your tobacco leaves, you got your cannabis plants, then you got to make it into something, and then you got to retail it. And so, with cigarettes in general, the same person is doing steps A, B, and then going into the kind of the C stores. In cannabis, you could have the same person doing all three. You could have the same person doing one of each. And so the question is kind of how does that lie? You could have direct to consumer. You can have online delivery. I mean, there's so many different variables. I agree with you that retail won't be as affected because at the end of the day, like you're going to go to your local store. It doesn't matter what the product on the shelves is, but the product itself is very vulnerable. And if we see what's happening in cannabis, which is incredibly fast growth in direct to consumer and delivery, the entire alcohol penetration for delivery right now is like sub 3%. And alcohol's been around forever. Cannabis in California is very quickly getting towards 25%. So you just have like a new medium for the consumer, and all these things could be very disruptive over any period of time.
Yeah,
Sean-
I just got an order of from Ease just the other day.
I was just going to say, Roger, you and I both get delivery.
Yeah.
Sean,
Once you know what you want, why go to a store? Right?
Yeah, exactly. Sean, I had a question for you. Since you know this as well as anyone, the Canadian growing pains that they experience, do you think that's going to happen here? Not overpopulation, but overbuilding of cultivation, and just kind of like I look at some of the companies in Canada where they $1 million square foot operations, they're just dead right now because they just couldn't scale it up. And I just want to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do. And I actually think it is happening in real time as we speak. I think what's happening is the price of wholesale, for instance, in California has come in a lot. And so what you're seeing is growers, in order to sell a product above wholesale, need to control their shelf space. So now all of a sudden in California, there's a huge rush to get vertical and own your shelf space, meaning buy retail or buy an e-commerce platform or integrate within one. And this was inevitable. I mean, if I started my own alcohol, it's going to be very, very hard to get into Costco, right? It's the same concept. And I think we're seeing that play out pretty fast. And one big lesson that I've kind of learned over the last year or so is, I used to believe this was very similar to alcohol, and you had your top shelf, your middle shelf, your bottom shelf, and the consumer wanted to buy in each price point. But I think the difference with cannabis, I think there's premium and then there's everything else. And so I really do believe that the consumer is less discerning as it relates to quality below a certain price point. They just want the most THC, or they want that strain, or they want whatever it is for the cheapest price. And so that, I think, is a big difference, which is forcing people to try to figure out how to get margin. And the only way to get margin or get your product even sold is to control the environment where it's being sold.
Yeah, like my habit is I just use gummies. I mean, that's my sole thing. So what I mean by that is there are I can see how the difference between premium, I don't care about other than what strain it is, whether it's indica or whether it's sativa, that's it. I mean, for me, that's about as far as I go, is about whether I care or not, and whether how many milligrams it has, right? 10 milligrams versus 2.5 versus 5 milligrams of THC. I take about 40 milligrams at a clip. So that's
well, it's like anything else. I mean, you have connoisseurs that will have their high end stuff that they want to do, and then you have everybody else. So I can totally see that. But do you see you're talking about how tobacco has point A, B, and C in, like, it's the one company that does it all. Is that going to start happening with marijuana growers? Are they going to start growing, packaging, selling, lobbying, and everything else to get to corner and become like the common household name of marijuana across the country once it becomes legal.
So, I mean, you have business models that are already built for that because they're mandated by the state. So in Florida, for instance, you have to grow, you have to process, you have to retail all under the same roof, or sorry, under the same banner, I should say. So there are business models that are already queued up for that. I think inevitably it's a free market and certain people will specialize and be better at certain aspects of it. And that to me seems more logical. That being said, it's very possible somebody just is so efficient and is able to extract such good economics being fully vertical, it makes sense. We are not seeing I don't know if there's an MSO, a multi-state operator today that could pull it off across all 50 states if we went legal. And so we're still a long way away from that kind of scale. But you are seeing certain growers in California that, in the scenario we went legal, they could pretty quickly get up to speed to get enough product out the door to get to 50 states. So we'll get there. I think nothing is imminent though.
I mean, is it even something you want? I mean, it's like anything else. It's a product that should be fresh and probably local.
Yeah, the answer to that is, to Roger's point, if you're having a gummy, you don't really care, right? You're just, in general, it's getting a little more sophisticated now, but in general, you're just taking milligrams of THC, which even today is fairly commoditized and you can buy pretty cheap. And so if we're talking about what we're seeing in the marketplace, which is consumers are moving off of smokables, specifically vapes, and into beverage and into edibles, yeah, it doesn't really matter where it's coming from because it's just an active ingredient. It may be grown in a lab one day. So we're definitely evolving. And I think the risk here is to the smokable segment. I think actually flower is far more insulated than vape because consumers in general want to know what's going into their body. And when you've got some sort of viscous liquid, nobody knows what the hell's in it necessarily.
Yeah, I still think premium flower is going to dominate. Those people that can cultivate it, they're going to dominate that, that line of flower. But I agree with Sean on the gummies, the drinks, everything like that. It's going to be commoditized pretty quick. But I also do think it's important that each state has their own flair to it. Like, if you're going to California is the first place I saw joints that had hash oil in them, right? That's the first place I saw them. I'm sure they existed, but that was something that I found in California. Or if you go to Colorado and you find a brand you like, and just slapping a brand on a flower because it was grown like it is in another state.
Well,
yeah, I mean, going back to kind of the analogy that I keep using with our investors is if you talk about gambling, right? Like you can have a dominant market share and be one casino operator in New York and have no presence in Las Vegas or no presence in Michigan, whatever it might be. I mean, I think there is local loyalty and there is a value to the physical location itself, but it's definitely going to consolidate and it's definitely not going to be the way it is now where we've got thousands of operators. The same way there's not very many mom and pop casinos. Those will get bought if they're out there, right?
Well, is there an analogy to be made with cannabis the same way that I guess we would call it the craft brew phenomenon exists? Obviously InBev, Anheuser-Busch, Molson, the big distributor out of Mexico, the name is escaping me, that makes Modelo. There's a couple of them, right? There's a lot of massive conglomerates out there, but when you go out into the world and you go into your local liquor store or
good
bodega,
liquor store,
good liquor store, there's a lot of beer out there. Is that going to be the dynamic with marijuana?
There used to be more though too. In the 90s it was really big, craft beers. In the early 2000s I see them less and less now because they all got bought up, just like all the indie bands in the 90s by the corporate, all these minor craft beers, if they were any good, all got bought up by those big distributors.
I agree. Yes, obviously that did happen, but there's still a lot shelf space dedicated to, the tree houses of the world or the Southern Tiers. And, I'm not that well versed. Maybe these guys are backed by conglomerates. Maybe they did get bought up. I know Blue Point Brewery got bought and a lot of other smaller brands got bought. But will there be an opportunity for small startups and the second part of that question, is there a massive conglomerate S&P 500 constituent like an Anheuser-Busch or a Philip Morris waiting to just come in and own the space? Is that where you guys see this?
Yeah, I
going?
mean, look, I think the craft beer analogy makes total sense. Like the reality is a lot of those craft beers are owned by these conglomerates. But, in Connecticut, you've got local Connecticut beers that people want to drink. You've got local beers in Missouri, wherever you go. I think cannabis will always be able to support a local craft community. Similar to what we were just talking about with the financial aspect, it's very difficult to do this business because of the illegality, the lack of banking, the tax regime. So it's not as easy to stand these up, but in the future, it's not crazy to think like it looks just like craft beer. We've got the same craft beers in every liquor store, and then you've got the local guys. So that to me seems totally logical. I think we're seeing that in California. There's definitively a handful of guys that we think are going to survive that premium category. And they're not going to be in every dispensary, but people will seek them out and they will pay a premium price for it. And so definitively, I think you're right. In terms of like the large conglomerates, I mean, you are seeing guys dip their toe in. I mean, in Canada, you've got deals with British American Tobacco, you've got deals with Altria, you've got deals with AB InBev. Nothing like that. No moving beyond the Constellation deal of Canopy Growth, which is the biggest in the space. But we know for a fact everyone's looking. We know for a fact people are getting up to speed. We're actually seeing more and more people leave the beer, or the alcohol industry to come into cannabis. So you're seeing a lot of those resumes. And so I do think it's inevitable. I think it's a more logical jump from alcohol to cannabis than it is from tobacco to cannabis because of all the negative health associations with tobacco. And, I think there's a lot of stigma that cannabis is actually trying to go the opposite way from and be more of a wellness product. So we'll see what happens inevitably, but this is $100 billion industry, and those don't just pop up every day.
So you're saying that big tobaccos, are they trying to buy up a lot of cannabis companies or not? I mean, it seems like a natural extension, even though you just said.
Yeah, you've seen Altria, you've seen British American Tobacco, you've seen Imperial, you've seen them all wade in slowly. Again, Constellation being on the alcohol side by far the biggest bet. But I mean, without a doubt, people are watching. Global tobacco usage is not growing. Right. And there's only more regulation along with that. So, and these guys are flush of cash and they have businesses that generate a lot of cash. So it makes total sense. And you're definitely seeing them at the conferences and seeing them kind of dip their toe in. But like anything, $1 billion acquisition for them doesn't really move the needle. And so if you're them, wouldn't you wait until you know who kind of the winners are and who's going to be at the table in 5 years? And I think that's, back to the consolidation point, that's where we are right now. Me and my job is to bet on who's going to be at the table. And this is what I do for a living. But these tobacco guys, they're still not ready to make that bet. I think they're getting up to speed, they're learning. But, they'd rather pay a couple billion more and make sure they're right than waste their time doing this.
Yeah.
Brian,
go ahead.
I was going to say, Brian and Sean, feel free to weigh in as well. Is there a certain type of entrepreneur or demographic or age range? It seems like the marijuana and maybe the old school InBev and alcohol conglomerates are kind of like an older generation. Is it fair to say that most of the folks coming in, whether it be the Canadians or is this like a younger mindset? What's the mindset of the business person and maybe these LLCs that are getting off the ground and bringing the product to the market? What are you guys seeing? Like, what type of people are we talking about here?
I think one of the most interesting things about cannabis is if we took like a smattering of what you're asking about and put them in a room, it would be every walk of life imaginable. The Ivy League, the former convicts, you name it, we've seen it. The guys that are really getting off the ground right now are the ones that have a business model that makes sense given the regulatory environment, and the guys that are able to get capital. I mean, the biggest issue for startups right now is capital and figuring out exactly where to play. You know, there's a lot of brands in California that will go to zero because they're not going to get the shelf space. They're not going to be able to get even the product to brands. And so I think it's the entrepreneurs that understand exactly where they're playing in the value chain, and then the guys that are hungry, because I do think it's still a very kind of push and shove type industry where you got to figure out how to get in there, and it's only getting more competitive every day as those shelf space agreements get taken. So I think the answer is, you see everything. The CEOs we like the most are generally the ones that are more afraid to fail than who want to be rich. And so we see the guys that are taking the leap and coming into the industry who don't want to put their head down and crawl back to finance or crawl back to consulting. Those are the guys that we like to bet on. And so that's my take, but, you know, curious your side, Brian.
Yeah, my hope is that we don't have this massive consolidation. You know, I went into a dispensary, and I was in Santa Barbara, and I went into a dispensary, and there were so many brands there. It's overwhelming. And I hope, you know, that it doesn't turn into the, you know, you can go in and buy 10 different things. I do like going in and seeing if there's 50 different options for, you know, the 5 different, how many ever different categories. If there's, you know, 10 different brands of flour, 10 different brands of edibles or oils, tinctures, all those things. I think that create the thing I'm drawn to is just the assortment that you get in the cannabis industry, and everybody trying to put out their best product and see if they can win. Now, I know there's going to be winners and losers, but I think there's a lot of charm in that. I think that there's another faction of people coming in with you know, MBA players who are starting funds, and Chris Webber, who has his fund going. I think it's going to add a lot of flair to the industry. I think it keeps it and fresh. So I hope that we have some time before we get there. But sadly, I bet you I'm wrong. My fantasy of, you know, this marijuana utopia is probably going to end sooner than later. But that's been the exciting part about being in it, is just watching the roller coaster ride that it's been, and watching these brands go up and down, and the ones that get more shelf space and survive. I hope that never goes away. That's why I hope that the federal legalization kind of stays away and lets states figure it out themselves. Because if you let the companies kind of figure it out themselves, the winners and losers will happen on their own, and they won't be kind of forced. I think that's kind of the beautiful part of cannabis, is it's not dominated by, you know, Budweiser, Bud Light. I think it's fun to watch going to, you know, Colorado, and my favorite brand being Veritas, right? Or going to California and the hash joints, and, you know, just the assortment, that the assorted ways that you can go and buy this product, I think separates it from those other things. There's a real you know, romantic part of it for me, because it's a lot of fun to see this.
Yeah, the neighbor next door brought over this brand called Fuzzies. Familiar with those?
Is that the joints?
There's a joint dipped in looks like a carpet of hash.
Yes.
It's sort of branched over it. That's a lot of fun.
Well,
yeah,
one thing
that's fun.
You should try. You should stop your gummy obsession and try that out. Let us know how it goes.
One thing that's interesting though is if you talk about all of this, like the packaging, everything you know, you have a few different types of packaging. You have packaging that you can see has like a medical kind of vibe to it, and I don't know if that's by virtue of a lot of these states that were medical only once, so there's a lot of information about the THC and the terpenes and everything else that goes on and into it. And then but you are now starting to see like a little goofier and marketing driven styles of, you know, gummies and joints and everything being sold. Now, it does bring up the topic of regulation though. And when the Fed, if the Fed does ever legalize, is it only medicinal? And if it is medicinal, is that worse than like a blanket legalization all across the board?
I think the answer is, you know, to your point about packaging first. I mean, I live in Connecticut. And I'm a medical patient in Connecticut. You can't even call a strain by the strain name. You have to basically call it some some very homogeneous indical A, sativa B. It's with no colors, no nothing. And so, certain states have taken a very hard line. I mean, a lot of people and a lot of lobbying dollars have said, well, you don't want to get edibles in the hands of kids. You don't want names that sound like candy and whatnot. And that probably makes its way into some form of federal advertising laws, because again, people are going to be very sensitive around the kid issue and getting it into the hands of minors. But at the end of the day, we're still talking about a product that there is going to be some fun element, and there's going to be some sort of like new creativeness. And, if you are going to get people convinced that this is a safer alternative for sure to opioids, but potentially even to alcohol and tobacco, then, it's hard for me to take someone seriously and say, we're going to overregulate that versus what you see in a liquor store. And especially now that you basically have hard liquor available in every store because of the prevalence of hard seltzer and, the different things and the ways they figured out to work around those rules, it's going to be really hard to see that. So, on the advertising side, I think they'll allow some advertising, but the candy, the kids stuff, that probably goes. And then to your question about, what legalization actually means, again, this is why I think in general the space has been so weak from the stock perspective, is people are like, wow, it's a really big question. What does it mean? I mean, there's for sure a scenario where medical legalization only actually makes things much worse to be an operator. But I think what we want to see is just making cannabis no longer illegal. And if that happens, that really opens things up. We don't need to say, X, Y, and Z is what we call legal cannabis. We just need to say, hey, cannabis in any form is not illegal. But then of course, if it's no longer illegal, why aren't you going to still see the black market thrive, right? And you see a version of that in Oregon right now. So there's a lot of questions about how do you deal with it. I mean, I keep going back to, at the end of the day, me, my wife, whoever, we want to know what we're buying and what we're putting into our body. And that's the biggest tell. And likewise, hopefully these supply chains get big enough and to kind of crush Brian's dreams a little bit. If the supply chains get big enough, then they're going to be cheap enough to compete against somebody that's not paying a 40% tax rate. And that's the issue. I think one thing people don't realize is if I want to make my own gin or make my own beer, it's really freaking hard. If I want to just put a plant in my windowsill, it's not that hard. And so, it's a much more difficult black market to keep out of the game than it is alcohol. And so you have to thread the needle there, where you don't want money going into the wrong hands and you don't want profits going into the wrong hands. But you also want to give people access and not make this astronomically expensive.
Just to add to your medical question, one of the interesting things that's happened this year is the DEA giving out permits to some growers, the third-party growers. They're going to start doing research on it, and I'll be curious to see where that goes, because University of Mississippi's had it for years, and now there's a big operation in New Mexico I know has been given a permit. But I'll be curious to see where that goes, where the feds
Always
take
New
that.
Mexico.
Always New Mexico. It's always in Area 51, right?
Yeah.
I'll be curious to see what they have up their sleeve. They're up to something with it, if it's some sort of medical research. And another curious thing is there's such a stigma for marijuana, but you're seeing mushrooms and those types of companies being listed on exchanges. It's strange, and they're doing the same sort of medical benefits of that, right? So it's curious that we don't get more leeway with cannabis in the medical realm, biotech realm, but everybody seems to be okay using the mushroom route. So
the psychotropic drugs are gaining speed as far as getting to the
I
sort of
think that
mainstream.
they look to be gaining speed, but if you actually look at their business models, they're more analogous to what GW Pharma was doing, which was on a major exchange, than they are to what Curaleaf is doing, for instance. And so they're running federally legal drug trials, not necessarily in the United States, sometimes in the Netherlands, sometimes in the UK or wherever. So they're not violating any federal laws. And it's much, much more of a biotech healthcare play than cannabis, cannabis investing, which in general is more of a consumer retail play. So I do agree with you, though. It's having its day in the sun. But if it's anything like cannabis, the process to get anything over the line with a regulator is not fast.
But it's not it's an open secret that sport tripping out here in in California, it's all of California, particularly Northern California, where they do these ayahuasca trips. These heavily advertised. They get it's at a compound. They have leaflets. They hand out to people, and nobody seems to really give a shit. That they're doing it, particularly in Northern California. I just see that more and more happening in other places. In New Mexico, of course, we talked to Strassman, they were doing the DMT experiments in New Mexico, University of New Mexico. I just, it's funny how some things I'll never be able to get, though, no matter how legal marijuana becomes. I'll never be able to get opiated chocolate Thai stick legally ever again, though. I mean, or legally ever. And that was always my favorite weed when I was a kid. It was the best weed I ever had. I guess that will still be illegal. There'll still be some things that will be illegal, even with legalization.
It's so hard to know. And I think one other dynamic that people aren't talking about, but again, like if you think about what are people going to use 5, 10, 20 years from now, THC tolerance is a real thing. You hit a vape all day, after a couple of weeks, that vape's not going to do anything for you. And so I think we're seeing that, and we're seeing one of the reasons, again, vape is suffering is exactly that. Flower is more potent, edibles can be more potent, drinks, whatever. And so to your question, you can have a cancer patient who can consume 1,000 milligrams and not get high. And we just don't know what these end products are going to look like. And we don't know when you're taking that type, there's no one alive who's taken an edible for 50 years. So we don't know what that's going to do to people and what their tolerance is going to be down the line. So we just have a lot of questions left to answer.
I disagree with that last statement. 50 years ago is not too long ago. They've been baking chocolate chip cookies with marijuana since the 1960s. So there have been people that have been 50 years alive eating edibles.
That's a fair point.
We could probably get a good study group, go over to your grandpa's house or somebody, get a good study group on that. What's been the effect for 50 years of chocolate chip cookies?
It's interesting though, but sorry, George, real quick about the vape. I mean, that's why we stopped vaping, is because it's a weird and unknown substance, and you'd build a tolerance so quickly. It doesn't seem to. So, and that's actually a really good point, because that's going to keep the business changing. You're not going to have your brand of cigs like, your aunt smoked Cools or whatever her whole life. That doesn't exist in this world. So you're going to have to constantly switch it up, and that lends itself to a competition. But I also don't want to see Joe Camel with a joint out of his mouth. I'd rather see more of a medical labeling, I guess, or clarity on the labeling than a goofy something targeted towards kids,
Yeah, guys, I was just gonna say, if you guys want to take a quick break, and because I know we've blown
way over
3 minutes, so if we want to take a quick break, and then we'll just do a little bit more. I know I have one question I want to ask, and then Roger, Pete, if there's anything you guys want to cover.
Yeah, we could take a break and do a wrap up.
Yeah, all right, great. I'm gonna just hit pause real quick, and I'll be right back.
I really have to use the bathroom.
That's where I ran out. I was like, I gotta go. Right back, guys.
All right, we're back with Sean and Brian and the Buzzards, talking all things cannabis, regulation, Fed, and everything in between. Even some mushroom talk in there too. I know we're getting towards the end here, guys, but I know George had another question. Fire away.
Yeah, Sean, I'm glad, it's not a great topic, but you've brought it up I've heard you mention it a couple of times, and it's been on my mind, is the opioid, marijuana as an alternative to opioid addiction, which, I mean, it makes plenty of sense to me, and I'm not that smart. I don't even have a Regis diploma. Do you think that the Pfizers of the world, the Sackler family that was paying off just about every politician, world leader, philanthropist, Ivy League institution, were those sort of companies in the way of repressing marijuana? And we're seeing, obviously, there are medical benefits that are not ruining lives and destroying civilization like the opioids are. Were those sort of big, massive, and Brian, you can weigh in here too. With these big organizational Pfizer Dow component, were they in the way? Is this why marijuana was not acceptable for the long time?
I think it actually, it's even bigger than that. I think it was more systematic racism. You know, marijuana with an H was originally what was made illegal effectively to control the flow of Mexican migrants into the United States. And so, and then you saw a kind of a renaissance in the 60s and 70s, but then you had all the various crime bills starting in 1979, basically to put as many non-Caucasians in jail as possible for low-level cannabis offenses. So I don't even think they've needed to, frankly. I think that this has now become a newer thing where you're talking about opiate replacement, but in general, marijuana has been very much masked by kind of the guise of racism and what that's meant to kind of putting people incarcerating different communities and oppressing large parts of the population systematically.
Seems like you have a wailing soundtrack
Yeah.
behind you to kind of correspond with what you were saying.
Well, I mean, George, there is a connection. I mean,
There
you
is,
know, there's a connection there, and you know, we can only hope that, as Sean said early on in the podcast earlier, that this is going to help. You know, the rise in use of marijuana and medical use of marijuana is going to help with all these problems. So,
Well, and
You
you
know,
hope,
I guess I'll end with an anecdote of something that I experienced firsthand 2 weeks ago. My father was in a bike accident down in Florida, so I flew down there and stayed with him in the hospital. And on the way out of the hospital, they send the doctor who's in charge of pain treatment to kind of give you kind of like a final assessment. And the doctor down in Delray, Florida, basically said, "We want you not to take painkillers. We want to give you a medical marijuana card." Of course, being my father, he had a medical marijuana card to begin with. But you know, it was great to be in the room when a doctor in
When
a
you heard that.
hospital came in and said exactly that. So, you know, it's happening. You're seeing it. To what you said earlier about Pennsylvania, I mean, we think West Virginia, because of the opiate instances in West Virginia, is going to be actually a very good marijuana market. We're seeing it in Ohio. These are really exciting places because there is an element of getting people off of opiates for sure, and it's happening.
yeah,
I'm rooting for DMT to take that over too. So anyway, go ahead, Brian.
Oh, you know, what I wanted to say was, you know, I think there's a long way to go with this. I don't think, you know, we talked about weed being the devil's lettuce the last time. It's not even close to that. There's a lot of benefits to it. You're seeing that through COVID. A lot of people, you know, using it at night to sleep because there's a lot of stress in this world. And this stuff, you know, if you don't use it, you can notice that it can affect your sleep habits. And some people need it to sleep. And, you know, I think there's more and more people that are learning the benefits of it. And as more time goes, it turns away from this stigma of negativity to this. There's a lot of benefits, and COVID has proven that. And I think COVID has put a little dose of juice into this market, and it's only going to keep going. So as long as we keep on the trajectory we are, and Sean's story is a good one as well, as long as doctors and you get medical professionals buying into this, which they should, and the more and more research that we get at universities and in medical facilities where, you know, the benefits of this are unearthed, and, you know, those days are going to be these days of opioids, and those are going to be numbered.
absolutely. I think we're getting there, guys.
Yeah, that's a good place to almost wrap up. Go ahead.
Absolutely. I only had one last question for Sean. So your fund, is that like an ETF? Is that something you're saying it cannot be traded on the stock market, or
We're a hedge fund. So you subscribed into my fund as a limited partner, and then you share proportionally in the investments the fund itself makes.
So if a regular Joe guy like me walking around wants to invest in it, how would they do that?
Yeah, so we can't take regular Joes. We have to take investors, and you know, there's certain thresholds of the types of people we can take from a legal standpoint. But you know, if you ever have any questions about the fund, go to our website navycapital.com, and you can find someone on there to email.
Cool, thank you,
Yeah,
man.
and Sean has been on multiple media outlets, CNBC, right, Sean, Bloomberg. So if you look him up, we'll include a lot of his details in the write-up of this article. And Pete, I think, what Sean was saying, that from the SEC standpoint, they're just not even letting average Joes go near this. You have to be an accredited investor. Is that right, Sean?
Well, for my fund, yes.
Right,
But
yeah.
but even for these stocks, most brokerages, most kind of big wirehouses won't even let you trade them. That's not necessarily an SEC requirement, because the SEC is actually allowed not all of them, but several of the major companies to have effective S1s and be SEC registered companies. It's more the decision of the exchanges and the brokerages themselves.
Yeah. And to add on to how backwards some of this is, there was it Credit Suisse, Sean, that had to back out of all their positions?
Yeah, I mean, everyone's had a version of it.
Yeah.
I think that's more of like just a general risk management thing, given what happened earlier this year with Archegos blowing up.
But to add to that, the brokerage house I use, you can trade in it. So if you want to know, I can tell you after this, Peter. But some of these companies have lost their foreign private issuer status because over 50% of their shareholders are in the U.S. So they have to file with the SEC like any other company, listed on an exchange. So the fact that they can't be on an exchange is just, it's crazy. And not only that, it's really become a hindrance to these MSOs who have to compete with companies in Canada who can raise that institutional money on their, on the TSX, because they don't technically have TSX. They don't technically have cannabis exposure, but yet they're all setting up these sidecar deals to where they have an option to buy into the U.S. market at a very depressed price because they've set up the sidecar. So, the hypocrisy of that is not lost on me as I look at these companies on a daily basis. Is, what are we doing? I mean, it just makes no sense. People want this to be legalized on a medical standpoint alone. So why aren't we letting them invest in it as well? So hopefully we get there sooner than later.
That's a great point.
Well, Roger, did you have?
No, I was going to say about that time, right?
Yeah, it's about that time. Sean, I really appreciate you taking the time. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you again. I know that we haven't talked in a while, but it's always good to reconnect with folks on different paths in our journey. So thank you for coming on, Brian. I really appreciate you taking the time, and it would be great for you guys to stay in touch. I know you guys probably have a lot of synergy and opportunities, and good to connect. So I'm glad to see things are changing finally. So everybody, thanks for listening. I think more cannabis episodes are coming in the future. So please make sure to hit the citrus before you move the towel. We don't want to alert the RA. And thanks for listening. We'll see you guys again soon.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Thank you.
Take care.